Star Walker Studios presents Dungeon Master's Journey, your multi-dimensional D&D podcast. Hello, fellow gamer. Welcome to episode 274 of Dungeon Master's Journey. I'm your host, Lex Starwalker. On this show, we discuss the craft and the art of dungeon mastering. I've been running RPGs for over 28 years now, and I produce this show in the hopes that you can benefit from my experience, my triumphs, and my mistakes. So welcome back, everyone. It's been a little bit since the last episode, and I hope everyone is well and healthy and safe and sane. So welcome back, everyone. Took a bit of a break, and I'm back podcasting out of Star Walker Studios here in quarantine within the Fortress of Solitude here in Bellingham, Washington. And first of all, I did not misspeak. Those of you who follow me on Twitter or part of the MeWe community or our Discord community probably already know this, or you just noticed that I changed the name of the show from Game Master's Journey to Dungeon Master's Journey. What does this mean as far as the content of the show? What does this mean? Nothing. It means nothing. Nothing is going to change about the show. The only thing that changed was the name. And the reason for that is it's been quite a while since I've talked about a game extensively on here other than D&D. It's been quite a while since I take that back. I did run some Numenera this last summer for a little bit. But other than that, very brief foray into the Ninth World. Other than that, it's been quite a while since I've run or even played a game other than D&D as far as tabletop RPGs go. And when I started this show, I wanted it to be open to anything and talk about any game that I was running or playing. And in the early years of the show, we did discuss other games. I talked about the Star Wars RPGs quite a bit back then. I think, we talked some about 13th Age and some other games. But just these days, I pretty much play and run D&D. And I've got, a lot going on in my life these days. And I just, unfortunately, I've had to admit to myself finally that I'm not in college anymore. I'm not in high school anymore. I don't have the time I used to have to devote to this hobby. And I just, honestly, I don't have the time or the mental bandwidth to deal with more than one game at a time. I don't have time to run more than one game at a time. And I don't really have the mental bandwidth to be solid on more than one rule system at a time. I discovered that when I was running Numenera this summer, which even though that's a very simple and rules light game, and I used to be very, very well versed in that system. It'd been a few years since I'd run it or played it, and it was a bit of a learning curve again to get used to the new system. And back in the day when I was in college, I was usually running at least 2 campaigns at a time, sometimes more than 2. And usually those were different games. I had a D&D game I ran for years, and I had a Changeling game that I ran for years. And I was often running both of those at the same time. And then I also had a Star Wars game that I ran. And I usually was running 2 of those 3 games at any given time. And I could do that back then because I didn't have much to do other than my classes and my part-time job. So I had plenty of time to devote to it. But, I'm an adult now, things are different. And I just have had to finally admit to myself that I just don't have the time that I used to have. And since I like to GM, I would rather focus on one game that I like and be really well versed with that and comfortable with that than trying to take on too much and try to run 2 different games and do them both poorly or not feel comfortable with them. And that's the way it's been for quite a few years now. So that being the case, when I was thinking about the show over the holidays, actually. And, that time of year, I always kind of think about, what I want to do with the show and try to come up with if there's anything I want to change or anything like that. And, I just started thinking about how long it's been since I've talked about anything other than D&D. And, you all know what's going on. Everybody that listens to this show, you all know what's going on. But it occurred to me, any potential new listeners, it might be better for them if I had a title that was more D&D focused, since that's what I talk about, since it really is these days a D&D podcast. So I decided I would change the name just very slightly from Game Master's Journey to Dungeon Master's Journey, just so it's a little more clear for new listeners that this is a D&D podcast, in case that's what they're looking for. They know this is maybe what they're looking for. And also, if they're looking for something not D&D, they know that this isn't it. So I just feel like it's more clear and more transparent and honest to new listeners what we're about here at Dungeon Master's Journey. And I figured for those of you who already listen, it's a pretty minor change. It's not really going to change anything. So this is the first episode as Dungeon Master's Journey, but I'm not going to change the feed or anything like that. I did some research and it looks like I can just change the title of the podcast and everything will be fine. So that's what we're going to do. So as far as the content, the programming, is pretty much going to be the same as what you've been used to. There's nothing really changing because I changed the name, with the one exception that, at least for now, I'm not going to do the actual play anymore. And just in a nutshell, I've never had the downloads for the actual play episodes that I have for the regular episodes. It's less than half the number of downloads, which tells me that there's a lot of you that listen to this show that don't listen to the actual play. And they're a lot more work and time to produce. And I don't know, it just seemed like I was kind of shooting myself in the foot with the actual play, because it was a lot more work and time for a lot less, a lot less that I'm getting out of it, because most of you aren't even listening to the actual play. So it just made more sense to put more time and energy into the regular episodes that far more people are listening to than the actual play, where a relatively small number of people are actually paying any attention to it anyway. So if you're a huge fan of the actual play, I apologize. However, honestly, I brought this up in our online communities quite a while ago, asked people their thoughts, and didn't really hear from anyone who begged me to keep doing the actual play. I did hear from some people who said they enjoyed it, but would totally understand if I stopped doing it. But overall, heard from very few people total, which again, just kind of reinforced this idea of there's not really many people waiting up at night for my next episode of the actual play. So I'm sorry if you were a huge fan, but you kind of had your chance to speak up and didn't. So yeah, participation's important. And I talked about this in another podcast I did last week. I just started a new podcast called Lex Out Loud. That is a podcast where I'm going to talk about mainly science fiction and fantasy, TV shows, movies, books that I'm enjoying, just things in the media and popular culture that are kind of genre related that I'm enjoying, and hope to have a lot of fun with that. But I just put the first episode of that out last week, so you can check that out. It's on the website, starwalkerstudios.com. But I was talking about in that show how part of the reason I haven't made any episodes of this show for a few months is because the audience participation had dwindled to nearly nothing. Now, there are a few of you that I hear from on a fairly regular basis, and I know who you guys are, and I really appreciate you. So if you're one of those people, I'm not talking about you, because there are a handful of people who I hear from on MeWe or Discord or who email or whatever. But other than those like 5 people, I never hardly hear from anyone anymore. And, when I started podcasting, especially when I was doing GM Intrusions, which was one of the earlier podcasts I did. I used to get tons of audience participation and feedback. And I never really realized how important that was until it kind of went away. And I found myself running out of ideas of what to talk about and just running out of motivation to even do the show when it seemed like no one was listening. And I'm sure that's not the case. I'm sure people are listening. But when I never hear back from people, it seems like I'm just talking to myself and no one's listening. And after a while of that, it just seems like there's better things I could do with my time. So if you're listening to this show and you're happy to have Dungeon Master's Journey back, let me know. Tweet me, shoot me an email. I would love some ideas for topics for episodes. I really rack my brain these days trying to come up with things to talk about that I haven't talked about before. So yeah, if you have an idea, let me know. Dungeon Master, or wait, hang on. I just realized I don't think I have a new email. So for now, the email is gamemastersjourney@gmail.com. I've been trying to set up an email for the show with the new name, but the obvious ones I was trying, they were taken somehow. So yeah, I don't have, I need to work on that. So for now, it's still the old email, gamemastersjourney@gmail.com. Shoot me an email, give me some ideas. I really appreciate it. Or just say, it's great to have you back, Lex. Or say, you suck, just stop podcasting. Whatever, say something. I'd love to hear from you. All right, so today we're going to do a couple or a few different topics. I have gotten some correspondence from some people after I just was bitching about not getting feedback. I do have a couple emails, voicemails, things like that to discuss. And you know, we're in the territory now in the show where I'm willing to revisit things because honestly, I think it's all been said at this point. So if someone writes in with something, even if it's something I feel like I've talked about before, I'll do it, especially if it's something that I haven't talked about for a while. So our first topic that we're going to talk about today comes from listener DM Adam, who wrote in about higher level characters in a lower level published adventure. And what do you do about that? So let me pull up that email real quick. All right. And I am trying to do this on my phone to try to eliminate using my computer to try to eliminate some of the background noise for you guys. So we'll see how this goes. This may be something I don't do again. So Adam wrote in, this was quite a while ago. So Adam, if you're listening, sorry it took so long. But I did respond to Adam by email. So I've answered his questions when he emailed me. This was back in January, actually, end of January. But I thought this is a topic that might interest some of you. So I thought I'd talk about it on the show. So Adam says, I've been listening to Game Master's Journey for a little while now, and I've enjoyed some serious laugh out loud, coffee on the desk moments. Well, that's awesome. Thanks, Adam. I hope it didn't make too much of a mess. And I want to thank you for the practical advice you've given me on game prep. Oh, you're very welcome. I had a question about higher level characters, and I'm hoping you'd be willing to offer a suggestion or two to a new 5th edition DM who's dipping a toe in the D&D world again after a long hiatus since the AD&D games or days. That's awesome. Welcome back to D&D, Adam. Wow, that's really cool. I'd kind of be curious on what someone who last played D&D in 1st or 2nd edition days, what they think of 5th edition, assuming you didn't play 3rd or 4th edition. I'm just curious because to me, it seems like there's a lot in 5th edition that came from 3rd edition. So I'm just curious for Adam or anyone else who went straight from 1st or 2nd edition right to 5th edition. I don't know what that was like for you and what you think of the new system, I guess. So Adam says, my PCs are currently second level. They have a party of 8. Holy cow. And they are playing in Lost Mines of Phandelver. He says, I'm going to finish Lost Mines of Phandelver and transition them to either Storm King's Thunder, Curse of Strahd, or Out of the Abyss. Though your description of Hoard of the Dragon Queen in today's episode makes me want to have a serious look there also. Yeah, and I don't even recall now if I mentioned this on the show, but they did republish Tyranny of Dragons, which is Hoard of the Dragon Queen and The Rise of Tiamat. They republished those a few months ago as a single book, and I've been told that they did some more editing. I haven't gone through it with a fine-tooth comb myself to see how extensive the edits were and if they really fixed all the problems about or that exist in Tyranny of Dragons. But if you're interested in Tyranny of Dragons, I did a blog post on my blog over at starwalkerstudios.com/blog. It's called something like my review and rebuttal of Tyranny of Dragons or something like that. But anyway, at the very bottom of that blog post, I have a ton of links of some great resources I found to help you kind of fix the dog's dinner. It was kind of Tyranny of Dragons. And I don't know for sure, but I sincerely doubt that Wizards' retreatment of it in the new edition did much more than just, fix some typos here and there and fix some of the more glaring editorial stuff. I doubt they did much as far as fixing, the encounters or anything like that. So if you're wanting to run this campaign, check out that blog post for a lot of resources that you can use to help you out and find those problem spots and fix them and make them better. All right. Anyway, back to Adam's email. So yeah, they've done Lost Mines of Phandelver, and he's wanting to take them into one of these other adventures. So he says he'd be starting with the PCs at 5th level, and it seems that by following the adventure as written, there's a huge chunk that won't get played. As you noted, if I were to play all of Storm King's Thunder, how hard would it be to increase the difficulty of the encounters to match the PC's level at the point they reach the encounter? Okay, so he gets into some specifics about the specific adventures. And like I said, I already responded to Adam by email. So instead of really talking about these specific adventures, I just want to address this as a more general question, which is, let's say I have a party of player characters who are already playing. They've already had some adventures or whatever, and I want to run them through one of the published adventures from Wizards, but they're too high level for the beginning of the adventure. What do I do? So that's what we're going to dig into today. All right. So there are some aspects of this that I think actually make this not as difficult to do as you might initially think. It is going to take a little extra effort on your part as a DM. I don't know that you'd want to just start running the thing out of the book as written if your player characters are significantly higher level than what the adventure is asking for. Now, if you're running a published adventure and your party is only 1 or 2 levels higher, and it's a party of, say, 4 player characters, 4 to 5 player characters, I wouldn't worry about it. I just run it as is. And if you feel like encounters are too easy or whatever, you can make adjustments on the fly by giving the monsters their maximum hit points, for instance, or having some new monsters show up to make the fight a little more difficult. Or you could just let that session be easy, and then in the future, maybe scale up the encounters a little bit, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. But I think if your party's average size and they're just 1 or 2 levels higher, I don't think it's going to be that huge of a deal. However, if they're more than 1 or 2 levels higher, or if you've got more than 4 or 5 player characters, then you're going to want to address it, because if you just try to run the thing out of the box, it's going to be way too easy, and it's not going to be fun. The problem really isn't it being easy or being even too easy. The problem is it not being fun. Having an easy encounter isn't the end of the world. Sometimes it can be a good thing. But if everything is so easy that the players don't feel challenged and they don't feel like their characters are actually in danger, it could start making it not fun, which is what we want to avoid. So the first thing that I mentioned to Adam, and I'll mention to you, is that in my opinion, pretty much all of the published 5th edition D&D adventures by Wizards, which are these huge, $50 books, these published campaigns, they all have what I consider to be a lot of filler, which is to say, and I want to kind of put a big asterisk here, a big footnote, a big caveat, and say, when I start talking about filler in an adventure, I am not necessarily saying that this given scene in this adventure is, quote, filler, which is to say it is useless. It will be useless to every dungeon master out there. That's not what I'm saying. Although that kind of filler may exist. For instance, Tyranny of Dragons. Those of you who've run it or played it probably know of the infamous Caravan chapter, which I think most people would agree could be called filler. And there might be some DMs out there that really got value out of that chapter, but they're probably the minority. For most of us, that would seem to be filler. But what I really mean when I'm talking about filler is from an individual DM's perspective. So if we took an adventure like, say, Descent into Avernus, and let's say we had 5 different dungeon masters who are planning to run Descent into Avernus, and we had all 5 of those DMs sit down with the book and use a marker or a highlighter or whatever and mark all the parts of the adventure that they thought were filler, which is to say a waste of space or just an encounter that's there to grant experience but doesn't really add anything to the adventure or the story, or doesn't have any danger, or an encounter that's just there to fill up pages, or to get the players from one level to another, but doesn't really contribute anything. That's kind of what I mean by filler. Something that where you're like, you know what? I think this adventure would be better if I didn't run this encounter, or if I didn't run this part of the adventure. If I just took it out, the adventure would actually be better than if I leave it in and use it. That's what I consider filler. So you could have 5 different DMs sit down with this adventure and label the parts that they think are filler. And if you compared, I'd bet that, there might be some in common, but I'll bet they'd be choosing different things, because every DM has their own taste as far as what they like, what they don't like, what they think is cool or interesting versus not. And every DM also has their own players. And a good DM, when they're looking through an adventure like this, they're not just thinking about what they like and what they think is worthwhile, but they're also thinking about their players and what their players like. So it just makes sense if you have 5 different DMs with very different players, that they would all choose different parts of an adventure to say, this is filler, I'm not going to use it. This is going to take away from the campaign, not add to it. So I just want to make that clear. I'm not bashing the writers or the designers of these adventures in any way, just by saying that I consider something to be filler. I'm very aware that what I may consider filler, you may not, or another DM may not, or something you consider to be totally useless filler in an adventure, I might think is really cool, or I might have an idea of something to do with it to make it really cool. See what I'm saying? So big asterisk there. Just keep that in mind. So anyway, in my opinion, all of these big, massive campaigns or adventures that Wizards puts out, they all have quite a bit of filler in them. Even Curse of Strahd, which is my favorite adventure they've made yet for 5th edition, which I have a lot of great things to say about it. You can check out my review of it if you want to know more of what I think of that adventure. Even so, there are parts of that adventure I would call filler. And if I were going to run Curse of Strahd today, I would seriously consider just not running those parts. And there can be different reasons for this. And, here are just a few possible reasons why there might be, quote, filler in an adventure. Some of them I already mentioned. One could be for experience. So, some dungeon masters just hand wave leveling, which is what I tend to do now, which is where you just decide, oh, you know what, you guys all level up. It seems like the right time for that to happen. Some dungeon masters use milestones, which is where you set certain goals that the player characters have. And when they achieve those goals, it's a milestone and they get a chunk of XP. And then some dungeon masters still use actual experience from encounters and monsters that they fight and things like that. So for the folks at Wizards to design an adventure, they kind of have to think about all those DMs. And, you don't so much have to design for the hand waving DM or the milestone DM, but you do got to think about the DM who's actually using experience, because this is the rules as written way to do it. This is what's presented in the books as the kind of default, or the assumption is that you're going to use experience, as far as, oh, you kill this goblin, he's worth 15 XP or whatever it is. So designing an adventure, you got to think about those DMs. And I've often criticized adventures in the past where they don't provide enough experience for the player characters to level up the way the adventurer seems to assume that they will, which means that you as the DM have to come up with additional encounters to add to the adventure to get them where they need to be. So I think that's the source of some of this filler, is you have the designer of the adventure saying, okay, for the next chapter of the adventure, I want the player characters to be 5th level, but they haven't had enough encounters to get them to 5th level if the DM's using XP. So I'm going to add some more encounters just for the sake of giving the player characters more XP. And if the writer doesn't give as much love and attention to those encounters as the other encounters, if the writer doesn't work really hard to make those encounters relevant and matter to the story, blah, 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 then that encounter can kind of feel like filler, like it doesn't need to be there. It's not really adding anything to the story or the experience for the players. It's just a way to get them more XP so they can be level 5 for the next chapter. So that's one reason you might have filler. Now, if you're a little more pessimistic or suspicious, you might think another reason to add filler is to take a concept for an adventure that could be done in a $10 module and expand it into something that you can put in a $50 book. Unfortunately, I do think this is the case with some of the adventures, especially adventures like Descent into Avernus, or I believe it's the Dragon Heist adventure, where half of the book isn't even adventure. It's Descent into Avernus. They got a big section on Baldur's Gate. And then I think it's Dragon Heist I'm thinking of, where they have a big section on Waterdeep. So it's like you're paying $50 for this book, and half of it isn't even adventure. And I'm saying half loosely. I haven't counted the pages. It's probably not half, but a good section of the book is a, quote, gazetteer. It's not actual adventure material. Also, some of these stories, Descent to Avernus has some really cool stuff in it. But to my mind, it's one of the worst adventures they put out as far as having so much filler in it. And I think it's for all these reasons. I think some of it is there just to give the player characters XP. I think some of it is there because, the story of Descent into Avernus would have made a great adventure for characters, say level 10 to 14. Or something like that. But they didn't want to do that. They wanted it to start at level 1 and go all the way to level 14, or actually, I think it goes to 17. So to me, the majority of the first half or more, honestly, 75% of that adventure, a lot of that is filler. And it's just ways to get the player characters high enough level that you can send them to Avernus and have the real story take place. Now they do some stuff so it's not completely filler. There are things that happen in those early chapters that do matter. But for instance, when I started running Descent into Avernus with my players, they were level 9 or 10, and I had no trouble at all starting them in that adventure at level 9 or 10 or whatever they were. And honestly, all the stuff in the adventure that was for lower level, I just took out. And there were like 2 or 3 things that they needed from that early stuff as far as information or an item or whatever. And I just found other ways to get them that information and was able to do it in a session or 2 instead of wasting however many months it would have taken to play through 10 levels worth of quote content or filler from that adventure. So, if you're more pessimistic, that could be a reason too of, hey, let's pad out this adventure so we can make it a full campaign and charge $50 for it. And it may not be a thing of they want to charge $50 for it. It could just be a thing of they want to give you a campaign. They want you to have something that will keep your player characters busy from level 1 to level 17. But unfortunately, their idea for an adventure really only uses half of those levels. So what do we do with the rest? Well, we just come up with this filler stuff. And, probably a lot of you are kind of nodding as you listen to this, if you've read or run many of these adventures, because a lot of these adventures suffer from this, especially in the early parts of the adventures. So if you're wanting to run your PCs through an adventure that's, assuming they're starting at, say, level 1 or whatever, and they're higher level than that, my first advice to you is look for things you can cut out that don't need to be there. If it's a published adventure, especially if it's one of these huge, campaigns that go from level 1 to 15 or 17 or whatever, chances are really good that there's a bunch of stuff, especially in the beginning of that adventure, that you can just skip entirely. And what I did and what I recommend you do when I was running Descent into Avernus or when I was preparing for it is go through like kind of mentally draw a line in the adventure where it catches up to the PCs. So let's say you're looking at an adventure, it goes from level 1 to 17 and your player characters are 8th level. All right. Look at your adventure and mentally or physically, if you want, draw a line where the adventure has the player characters at 8th level, right? So at that point, the adventure has caught up to the player characters, assuming that they stay the same level, right? And then look at everything before that. And what you want to do is the goal is to cut all or most of that out. So what you want to do is go through all that and look for things that you need from there. So is there some important information that they learn in those early chapters that they can't learn later that they're going to need? Make a note of that. Are there maybe important NPCs that they meet in those early chapters that they're going to need later? Make a note of that. Are there maybe important magic items or equipment they get access to in those early chapters that they'll need later? Make a note of that. So once you're done with that, you kind of have a list of, these were the things that they would have gotten from those first chapters that I'm skipping that I somehow need to work into the rest of the adventure so they still have that stuff. The other thing I would recommend is look through the encounters and whatnot from those early chapters you're going to skip and see if there's something really cool you want to do still. Chances are it's low level stuff. Most of it's pretty, probably going to be pretty run of the mill, like nothing special stuff that you can comfortably skip and not feel like the players are going to miss out on anything. But if you see a really cool encounter or a fight with a really cool monster or something like that, then keep it. And then once you've decided the important bits you need from that stuff you're skipping and any important scenes or encounters you're going to keep in, then figure out how to kind of fit everything together to make it work. Now, if this is something that any of you are interested in more detail, I would be willing to do a discussion on specifically how I did that for Descent into Avernus, what I cut out and why, and then how I stitched together what was left into something something that will make sense and be a satisfying story. And, we can ask my players how well I did at that, but so far it seemed to be going pretty well. And there haven't been any issues that I've noticed from doing that. But a big part of that is because I did my homework and I read through the opening chapters of that quite a few times to make sure that I was teasing out everything that they needed. So from Descent to Avernus, I'm not going to give spoilers, but there were there was quite a bit of pieces of information that they gained in those early chapters that they needed. So I just figured out new ways to give them that information later on in the chapters that we were actually playing, and it's worked fine. And also another thing, just as a quick aside here, this is something I recommend honestly doing with every published adventure you run. Don't get into the trap of feeling like you have to run it as it's written. The first thing I do with a published adventure is I just read the whole thing just to get a feel for what is this thing. And then the next thing I do when I start reading it a second time is I start thinking about anything I might want to cut out. If I read a certain scene or a certain encounter and I just think it's boring, or I don't think it will be fun, or I don't think it has a purpose, I think it will just waste time, because that's another thing. These huge campaigns they put out, they take forever to get through. So if there's a scene or something that isn't really doing anything for the story, it's just there to grant XP or whatever, and you can cut it out, I would cut it out, because anything you can do to make that campaign take less real world time to run is a good thing, because so many times we don't finish these campaigns because they're so long. So anything you can do to cut things out and shorten it without losing anything meaningful, it's just going to make the campaign better. It's like, think about a movie. If you're watching this awesome movie and then there's like a half hour of boring crap that you don't care about in the middle, it kind of kills the whole movie. And imagine how much better the movie would be if they just cut that out and just kept the good stuff. So that's what you can do with these published adventures. So yeah, that would be the first thing I would do with any adventure, but especially if you're wanting to run an adventure that starts at lower level with higher level characters, look at that low level stuff that's kind of too low level for them, and see how much of that you can cut out. And that's the easiest thing to do. So once you've done that, then you can look at what's left. And as far as the lower level stuff, you have different options. One thing is you can just run it as written. Like I said a little earlier, there's nothing wrong with having a particular encounter be easy. So you want to kind of think like a director, and think about the pacing of the campaign overall. Think about what's going on. If they just had a session with a really tough fight, then the next session, it's okay for them to have a super easy encounter. It'll provide a change of pace and whatnot. So some of the lower level stuff you can maybe leave just as it is, and just let them have an easy win. A really easy way to make an encounter more difficult, if you decide you want to make it more difficult to challenge higher level characters, is just add more people, add more NPCs or more monsters. So, if the encounter's with 4 goblins, use 8 goblins or 12 goblins or whatever. And the way that this game works with the action economy is just adding more bad guys will really crank up the difficulty pretty quickly, especially once they have more actions collectively than the player characters do. And there are guidelines in both the Dungeon Master's Guide and Xanathar's Guide for scaling encounters. I would recommend, if you're going to use one or the other, use the ones in Xanathar's Guide. It's a little quicker and easier to use. If you've got more time or you like crunching numbers, then use both. That's a lot of times what I do is I'll use both and just kind of compare what I get with both. But the system in Xanathar's Guide works great, and you can use that to help you scale the encounter up just by adding more bad guys. Now, if you have an encounter with like what I call a mixed encounter, which is to say an encounter with different types of creatures, you want to add more of the weaker guys. So if you got an encounter with like some goblins and some hobgoblins and then I don't know, a hill giant, I'd add more goblins or maybe another hobgoblin. I wouldn't add another hill giant because those higher CR monsters are going to really change the difficulty if you add more of those. So it's a lot easier just to add more of the minions. So I'd say one of the easiest ways to scale up an encounter is just add more of the lower CR monsters to the encounter. Use Xanathar's Guide to guide you as far as how many and what that'll do to the difficulty. And then another way, other than that, would be to add a single higher CR monster. Maybe you're going to add a monster that's a higher CR than any of the other monsters already in the encounter, or maybe add one that's equal to the most powerful monster. And again, this is going to depend on how far above the recommended level your player characters are. You know, if you're talking about an encounter written for first level characters and your player characters are like 5th level or higher, you know, yeah, I'd probably wouldn't just add a bunch more CR 1/4 goblins or whatever. I'd probably find a good CR 5 or higher creature that I can throw in that encounter. So there's at least something challenging about it. Again, that's if you want it to be a challenging encounter. Remember, not all the encounters have to be challenging to the same degree. You can have some easier ones. Okay, so finally, I kind of gave Adam like an example here. So looking at the adventure Curse of Strahd, so Curse of Strahd is actually based on an older adventure, which I'm blanking on the name of, that was by Margaret Weis and Tracy Hickman, and that adventure was pretty much just Strahd's Castle. So if you look at Curse of Strahd, the chapter that's Strahd's Castle and the encounters in there, that's basically the lion's share of what the original adventure was. So a lot of the other stuff, and that's like the last chapter in the adventure. So a lot of the other stuff was added later. So it's pretty safe to assume most of that is quote filler for the sake of this discussion, which is to say it wasn't part of the original adventure. Now there might be in one of those encounters, there might be a magic item or something that they need. So, you know, just decide which of those you're going to run, which not. And if there's a really important item that was in one of the places you're not going to use, just put it in a place that you are going to use. Just make sure that the player characters will have that item when they need it. And Curse of Strahd is a perfect example of that. I'm not going to get into specifics. I don't want to spoil it. But there are very specific magic items in that adventure that if the player characters find those, it makes it a lot more likely they'll be able to defeat Strahd. So, you know, if one of those items were in a part of the adventure you were going to skip, you'd probably want to put that item somewhere else in a place that they are going to go to. So yeah, so that's some of my advice and thoughts on running a lower level adventure for higher level characters. And again, this is all kind of assuming it's one of these big adventures, and at some point, you know, the adventure is going to catch up with the player characters. So yeah, if you have any other ideas on how to approach that I didn't talk about, feel free to let me know, and I can always come back to this later. You can shoot me an email at gamemastersjourney@gmail.com. All right, so I got another email from listener DM Joshua, and wow, this was a while ago. I'm not even going to tell you how long ago because it's embarrassing. But this is definitely something I've talked about on the show before, but I think it's been a while, so never hurts to hit it again. So Joshua, let me see. Let me skip ahead a little bit. He's talking about his D&D game. And he said, last night, everything went a little sideways. A couple of the players who balanced the character of the group couldn't make it. I understand I can't force players to do things I want them to do, but one player made the comment that his only plan for the night was to, quote, derail my campaign. He was part of the problem, but not the only issue. How do you deal with players who are out there to screw the campaign? Just trying to figure this out and how to handle this in the future so game night is fun for all. Thanks. So yeah, I mean, I have a really short, easy answer for this, which is how would I deal with a player who was out to screw over the campaign? I'd fire him. That's how I deal with him. Yeah, honestly, and this is a thing to keep in mind as a DM and as a player as well. It's not just about you, the DM. It's not just about you being the player who says, I'm out to screw the campaign, right? There's more than one person at the table. There's the DM and there's all the players. So let's say you have 4 players, that's 5 people at the table. And a player saying to the group, hey, my goal tonight is to screw the campaign, or whatever he said, is really that player saying, hey guys, tonight I'm going to have a good time and I don't really give a shit if you guys have fun or not. In fact, I'm going to have fun at your expense, because chances are good that going out to screw the campaign is not only going to ruin the fun for the GM, but probably for the other players too, at least some of the other players. Some of the players might be cool with that, but there'll probably be at least one other player who doesn't like what's going down. So it could be that this person thought they were being funny and they weren't being serious. But regardless, I mean, me personally, I would nip that in the bud right now, because even if the person thinks they're being funny and they're not being serious, it's not funny. And the fact that this person thinks that's funny, it reveals an error in their thought process that we should fix for them if they're going to keep playing at our table. Because the idea that I'm going to put my enjoyment above everyone else at the tables, the idea that that's funny, yeah, you got a problem if you think that's funny. And I don't really want to play with you if you think that's funny. So yeah, let's let this person know that, hey, that's not cool. That's not funny. Now, if they're serious, I mean, I wouldn't even bother with them. I mean, my gosh, we could write a book on what that must say about someone that they think that's fun and that's okay behavior to engage in when they're playing a game with their friends. But yeah, I don't know any of the people involved with this. I mean, if I had to bet, I'd bet that they were just trying to be funny and trying to be cute, and they thought they were doing that. And so I feel like just letting them know that that's not funny, that's not cute, it's not appreciated, and taking it very seriously. And also, I would do this in front of the whole table. A lot of times I'm a big fan of the, praise in public and what's the saying? I used to know this when I was a manager. But basically it's you praise people in public, and then if you've got to chastise them, you do that privately. Punish privately. I don't know. There's a neat little saying for it, but I don't remember. But normally I'm a fan of that. Normally I agree with that. I'm like, if you're going to say something good about someone, it's good to do that publicly so other people hear it and, this person can feel appreciated. Where on the other hand, if you're going to take issue with something someone did or said, it's better to do that privately so they don't get ganged up on. But this is an exception. This kind of situation is an exception because this isn't a comment that just involves the DM. This is a comment that involves the whole table. This is behavior that will involve the whole table. So I think the discussion of this or the dealing with this should also involve the whole table. And I would just, in front of the whole group, I'd say, this isn't cool. We're all here to have fun. And you just trying to, quote, derail the campaign, whatever that means to you, is that really going to be fun for everybody, including you? Or is that just fun for you? Because if it's just fun for you and it's going to get in the way of other people's fun, then that's not cool. And that's not what we're here to do. You can go play a single player video game if you want to have your own fun. This is a group social activity, which means, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few, right? So one person doesn't get to ruin everybody else's fun. And that includes the GM, of course. So yeah, that's kind of my response to that. And then also just from the GM perspective, it's really disrespectful. And I in my experience, because I have heard players say things like this, I've never heard a player say this who's ever run their own game before. This kind of crap usually comes from players who only play. And, it could be this person has no real concept of how much time and effort you put into your job as a GM or a DM. So part of this group discussion could be, you may not realize this, but I spend hours every week preparing for the adventure and working on NPCs, blah, 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 all the things that you do as a GM. And it's pretty shitty for you to set out to try to throw wrenches in my gears just for the sake of doing it and being an asshole. That's very disrespectful of me in the time that I've put into this outside of the time we're all together at the table, so that you guys can have a good time, so that we can all have a good time. How selfish can you be? And if this doesn't make this person ashamed and make this person truly see the error of their ways and be apologetic, then you don't want them at your table. You just dodged a bullet getting rid of this person because they're going to cause nothing but problems. They can go find a game for sociopaths elsewhere, I'm sure. So yeah, I know it can be hard sometimes as a GM, because one of the many hats that we wear is kind of the referee and trying to help everyone to have a good time and trying to help everyone get along. And you don't want to be confrontational and blah, 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 blah. But, there comes a time sometimes with certain players where the best thing for everyone is to get someone out of the group, because they don't play well with others. And, that point, if you're wondering, where is that line? It's when one person is ruining it for everyone else or for a significant number of the players. If you have one person who is irritating everybody else, the solution seems pretty obvious. And especially when they're, it's one thing. Some people are just annoying and they don't mean to be, or they have certain bad habits or whatever. That's one thing. But when you have someone who's outright saying, my goal tonight is to screw you all over as much as possible, you don't want that. So yeah, hopefully it's just a joke. Just let them know that kind of thing's not funny. But if this happens to you and the person is not joking, then don't be afraid to give them the boot and just tell them, just say, hey, that kind of behavior isn't appreciated. And if that's the way you're going to play, we don't want to play with you. Don't do the passive aggressive, cowardly crap of, not telling them when the next game, be an adult about it, tell them you won't die. It won't kill you. Maybe that will help them. If you just quit inviting them to the game, or you have it on a different night and don't tell them, or you have it at a different place and don't tell them, what good does that do them? Eventually they're going to figure out that you ghosted them, and they're going to feel just as bad, if not worse, as they would have if you'd confronted them about it. The only thing it's saving is you having to actually confront them. So don't fool yourself into thinking you're doing it to save their feelings. You're not. You're doing it because you don't have the spine to stand up to them. But if you do stand up to them, and if you tell them you're not welcome and this is why, maybe they'll learn something from that. Maybe the next group they play with, they'll behave a little differently because they've discovered at least one group won't put up with it. But if you just ghost them, then it looks like you're the one being the dick because, well, you kind of are. You just lost whatever moral high ground you had. So, don't be afraid to face it head on and tell them it's not cool. All right. Finally, today I got a voicemail from listener DM Knox. And since we're running a little long today, I'm not going to play the voicemail for you. I'm just going to give you the gist. So the gist is he has a character who is a Loxodon. I'm not sure what that is, but I don't think it matters for the sake of this discussion. The question is, this character has an ability where they get advantage on perception rolls involving smell. So Knox was wondering what I would do as a DM in a situation where I have a player character who has this ability that gives them advantage on perception involving smell. But let's say they're in a situation like they're in dim light or something where they would have disadvantage on sight. So he was wondering how I would handle that. And that's a really interesting question and an interesting kind of scenario, I guess. And it seems pretty niche at first. Like, I don't even know what a Loxodon is. I don't know if that's a homebrewed race or if I feel like I've read every D&D book at this point, but maybe I missed it somewhere. So I don't know what that is exactly, but so I don't know how common of a thing this is for people to have, but I don't think it's that uncommon for a situation like this to come up. So even if this is kind of a niche situation, I think if we kind of think about it more in general, it's not that unusual, and this is the kind of thing that will come up from time to time. So let's just think about this. So we have a character who has an ability from somewhere that says anytime you make a perception check involving smell, you have advantage. And then they have some other condition, perhaps it's dim light or something else, that's saying anytime you make a perception check involving sight, you have disadvantage. How do we handle that? So there's a few different ways you could go here. And I don't think there's a single right answer. I think it really depends on what's going on. It depends on the situation. So if you look at what I just said there, just the way this is, and I tried to say it the way it's probably worded in the book, or at least close to it. The wording itself gives you one answer. So the one ability says, anytime you make a perception roll involving smell, you have advantage. So right away, if the roll they're making doesn't involve smell, it's not relevant. So if they're rolling to see something, the fact that they have advantage on smell doesn't matter. It's not relevant. It doesn't come into play. The other rule says anytime you make a perception roll involving sight, you have disadvantage. So the same thing here. If what they're trying to do doesn't involve sight, then the disadvantage doesn't apply. And it just seems to me, just kind of thinking about this quickly, that most situations where you're making a perception roll are probably going to involve sight or smell, not both. So it seems more common that one or the other would apply, but not both, right? So the only thing I can really think of where this even becomes an issue where we have to worry about what do we do is the player character is about to make a roll where it can be argued that both of these would apply. So let me see if I can even think of an example where this could apply. Now I can easily think of an example using hearing and sight, but let me think if I can think of something using sight and smell. Because like, for instance, hearing and sight, let's just go with that because that's the example that just cropped into my head. I was thinking maybe you have a character who's sitting in the woods somewhere and you have a monster trying to sneak up on them from behind. Now, obviously, they're not going to be able to see the monster because it's coming from behind them, but they might possibly hear the monster coming, or maybe the monster smells really bad and they might actually smell it coming. So in this situation, I think I would think about what the player character is doing. So if you're just sitting there in the forest, like just hanging out, doing what you normally do, and you have something sneaking up behind you, let's say you're hard of hearing, okay? So for some reason you're hard of hearing, so you have disadvantage on perception rolls involving hearing, but you have this trait that gives you advantage using smell. Then I might say as a DM, I'm like, well, you're just sitting there. You're not doing anything unusual. You're just doing the usual thing. So it's like you're at disadvantage to hear the thing coming, but you're at advantage to smell it coming. And it seems reasonable that you could hear or smell it coming. I mean, some things you won't be able to smell, right? I mean, it would have to make sense that you could smell it, that it would even be possible to begin with, right? So in that case, I would say they cancel out and you just make a normal roll. You're at disadvantage to hear it, but you're at advantage to smell it. I, as a DM, think odds are about even of detecting it either way. I don't think it's necessarily easier or harder to smell it or hear it. So the disadvantage of one cancels out the advantage of the other, and you just make a normal roll. So that's how I'd handle that. But maybe the player character knows they have terrible hearing. So maybe they mention that they're trying to keep watch and they're trying to look around, and keep watch visually, but they're also like trying to really tune into their sense of smell and be really super aware of what they're smelling, to the, as opposed to like really listening for anything. So if it was something like that, I might say, okay, I'll let you have the advantage for the smell, and not have the hearing disadvantage cancel it out, because you're not really trying to use your hearing. You're just trying to use your smell, if that makes sense. But again, it's kind of a judgment call, right? So it really depends what you think is really happening as a DM and what makes sense to you. So now trying to think of an example using sight and smell. Wow, that's really hard. I wish Knox would have given me an example. Maybe he did. His voicemail was rather long, so there might have been an example in there that I forgot. When could you see or smell something? Smoke, right? Maybe something is on fire. Maybe there's a fire starting somewhere, and the DM wants to know if you notice it. So he either checks your passive perception or has you roll perception, and the DM's thinking, okay, you might see the smoke or you might smell the smoke. Seems equally likely that either could happen. You could either see it or you could smell it, or both. So yeah. And honestly, that's an example where I feel like you could argue it either way. I feel like you could argue that if I have disadvantage on sight and I have advantage on smell, and I'm trying to detect smoke that can be either seen or smelled equally easily, that they'd cancel out and it would be a normal roll. That totally makes sense to me. I think you could make that argument. But I also think you can make the argument that if I have disadvantage on sight because it's dark or because I have terrible vision or whatever, and I have advantage on smell, and I'm trying to detect smoke, I'm going to detect it with my smell anyway, not my sight. So I should get advantage for the smell, and we just ignore the disadvantage for sight. So this is someone who's kind of realizing they have an impairment, and they're like, I'm really, again, I guess this is similar to the other example. They're really focusing on their smell. Now the thing with that is you'll be able to do that once, and then the player is going to realize, oh, so the way Lex rules this is if he feels like I'm really focused on my smell, I'll get the advantage. But if I'm not, then, the disadvantage from the vision will cancel it out. And then the player will just always tell you that they're always focusing on the smell, and they'll just kind of game it that way. So that's something to think about. If that would bother you and you don't feel confident that you could keep them from abusing that, then maybe just say they always cancel out. But yeah, I think that's how I would approach it. It would be very situational. I can't imagine this being something where you would just say it always works this way. It just would really depend on the situation. So what do you think? I think this is a great question. It'd be really interesting to see how different DMs approach this. How would you handle a situation like that? And also, if you know what a loxodon is, tell me and where it comes from. GameMastersJourney@gmail.com. All right. Well, that is going to wrap it up, I think, for episode 274. Thank you so much to Adam, Joshua, and Knox for your questions and feedback today, giving me something to talk about on the show. I really appreciate it. Again, if you'd like to get a hold of me, you can email me at GameMastersJourney@gmail.com. You can follow me on Twitter @LexStarwalker. And you can also call my voicemail 951-GMJ-LEX1. That's 951-465-5391. We also have communities on MeWe and Discord. Feel free to join us there. You can find links in the show notes at StarwalkerStudios.com. If you have any comments or questions or any feedback, I'd love to hear from you. Not only will you keep me motivated and keep me going, but it'll give me stuff to talk about on future episodes. If you enjoy the show and you'd like to help support what I'm doing, I do have a Patreon. You can find the link to that at StarwalkerStudios.com and become a patron. Also check out my support page. There's a lot of other ways you can help me out. I've got Amazon referral links and all kinds of stuff. A lot of things don't even cost you anything, but they help me out a lot. So check out my support page on the website for more. There's a link at the bottom of the show notes. I want to give a shout out and a thank you to my new patron, Leo. Leo's been a patron for a while now, but this is the first time I've made a new episode since Leo joined. So welcome, Leo. Thank you so much for your support. Really appreciate it. And also, person by the handle of Aspiring GM was kind enough to leave a review for the show on Apple Podcasts or iTunes. And I'm confused what the difference is. But Aspiring GM says, I've been writing my own homebrew campaign as my GM debut. Awesome. Good to go. Good way to go. I have never played, much less been a GM or DM, but I want to dive in head first. Hey, that's the way to do it. I'm on episode 50 and powering through every episode. Well, hopefully, maybe you're caught up by now. You speak very clearly about the points you want to make and keep things entertaining while also heavily educational. Thank you. You've helped me develop my own world much faster than I had anticipated because you prompt me to ask the right questions. I look forward to the next 200 plus episodes. So thank you very much, Aspiring GM. I really, really appreciate that review. And if you review the show on whatever platform, let me know. And if you give me a 5-star review, I will share it on the show. But yeah, let me know. I pretty much know, I think, if people review me on iTunes, at least if they're in the US. If they're in another country, I don't. But yeah, even if it's on iTunes, if you leave me a review, let me know so that I can give you credit on the show. I really, really appreciate reviews. Definitely help new people find the show. And yeah, I'm really impressed that we have a new GM, never played before, jumping into GMing and jumping into world building. I am all for that. Maybe some people out there might say that's jumping into deep end. Maybe it is. I don't know, but I think it's great. I mean, that's kind of how I started. Well, no, I didn't world build right to begin with. I started running in Dragonlance, I think. But yeah, I when I started DMing, I'd only played a handful of times. But you know, it's a different age now with all the actual plays on YouTube and on podcasts. You can have never played, never DM'd anything and still get a pretty good education of how everything works. You don't have to go in blind like we used to. So that's awesome, but you're probably aware of all of that. But if you're not, definitely check out, some actual plays. If you find some you like, you can learn a lot from watching other DMs do what they do. And yeah, speaking of world building, our next episode, no, I guess it's not really world building. But I just got Matt Mercer's book, Explorer's Guide to Wildemount. I'm not sure which way he says it. Which is Matt Mercer's setting Wildemount, which is a continent of his D&D world that he uses in Critical Role, which is super cool. And we got the Eberron book not too long ago. Eberron's not really my jam. Nothing wrong with it. I'm not going to bash it. It's just not my cup of tea. But really cool to have a setting book. Also, we got the Ravnica book, which also is not my cup of tea. But yeah, we've gotten 3 good setting books for the game now, which is awesome. And I'm still working through the Wildemount book. But I think the next episode 275, I'm going to talk about a very specific thing from that book, which is namely his chronicle system, which is a way of doing some more with character creation and fleshing out the character's background. And I really like what he's doing there, and it's giving me some really good ideas. And I think there's some great ideas there for any DM, but especially DMs running in their own homebrew settings, but really running in any setting. You can take this kind of approach to help your player characters flesh out their characters before you even start playing, and have it have some bearing on the game, which is awesome. So I'm looking forward to talking about that next week. And I'm really excited about the Theros book. I can't remember what it's called, but it's coming out, I think, in a month or two, which is going to be another setting book. And Theros, like Ravnica, is another setting that comes from Magic the Gathering. And I love Theros. I was playing Magic when that setting came out, and it's based on Greek mythology, which I love Greek mythology, and I just love the art that they had for those cards. So I'm really excited about that book. I hope it's good and gives me lots of cool things I can steal for my world of Primordia. And that's what I love about setting books. I'd be totally happy if Wizards just started putting out setting books instead of all these adventures. I'd love to see more setting books from them, and I'd love to see either books of adventure collections like Tales from the Yawning Portal or Ghosts of Saltmarsh, or even better, just individual published shorter adventures that are like $10 a piece. Would be, for different level ranges, would be awesome. I've kind of had my fill of these huge long campaigns that, I mean, how many people can even run them? And how many, even if you can run them, how many of them can you run? You know, I miss the days when we had all these modules that were, these shorter modules that you could have oodles and oodles to choose from and kind of put together your own campaign. Because honestly, I've read every campaign they put out for 5th edition, and there's not one of them I think I could run the whole thing in its entirety without either me or the players getting bored with it before it was over. They're just too long and too much filler, which we talked about earlier. But yeah, so I'm happy to see some setting stuff. I'm also happy that they're taking some quote risks, and they're not just doing Forgotten Realms or Dark Sun or something they've done before, that they're doing some new settings like Ravnica and Theros. And I guess Eberron is in a new setting. Matt Mercer's, though, that's a new setting. Because honestly, I mean, I know there are people that they want a big Forgotten Realms book, or they want a Dragonlance book, or well, I guess they got their Eberron book, or they want a Spelljammer book or whatever. And I don't get it. It's all out there, guys. Those books have already been written, and they were written for different intentions, but it doesn't really matter with the setting stuff. Most of it's not going to be mechanic stuff anyway. And if it is, it's not hard to convert to 5th edition from the earlier edition. So if you want to know about the Forgotten Realms, there's more information than you will ever need about the Forgotten Realms already out there. And these days, you can get a lot of it for free on wikis and stuff online. You don't even have to go track down the old books. And I'm sure the same thing's true about Krynn or Athas or any of the other worlds from the bygone days. So yeah, I'd much rather see them come up with new stuff than just retread old ground. It's a little disheartening and disappointing to me as someone who's been playing D&D since 1st edition, how much of the stuff we've seen in 5th edition is just regurgitated stuff. Whole adventures, whole campaigns, just this basically the same thing as we had in a new earlier edition. Instead of coming up with new stuff, they just reprint old stuff, and it gets old, especially when you're already familiar with all that stuff. And it's not like they make huge improvements to it that it's like, oh, I'm so glad they did Undermountain again, because this is so much better than Undermountain was before. It's not. So yeah, that's just my opinion. But anyway, I am rambling now, so that means it's time to end the show. I hope that you have a chance to play your favorite RPG this week. I hope you have a chance to run your favorite RPG. You know what? I just realized I need to change this sign off, don't I? Now that I'm just doing D&D, it doesn't quite fit as well. So yeah, I'll be back soon with another episode of Dungeon Master's Journey, and hopefully by then I'll have an email figured out. Until then, game on.
This has been a Starwalker Studios production, your source for quality gaming and hobby podcasts.
This episode's music, courtesy of Cloudwalker, Transboy, Renfield, Stanko, and Ish. See the show notes for more details at starwalkerstudios.com/Game Master's Journey.